Chapter 13. She was the cause of it all. With the coming of that spring, Colonel, now a 3-year-old, round and fat as a butterball, and restless as an aspen leaf, he'd hardly put his head down for a tuft of bunch grass when it'd be up again and looking all around while he chewed on it. He'd walked on a ways for no seeming reason, and back again, but a fair reason then, for Colonel had taken on responsibility in the trim shape of a 2-year-old filly. He didn't have to fight no stud to get her, and he didn't steal her out of no bunch. She'd just come along like lost alone, and he'd just appropriated her. There'd been no fuss about it, and she'd right away went to grazing, and running close by his side, and plumb contented. As luck would have it, he'd been grazing well away from Charo and the other two when he first spotted the filly, and out of curiosity more than anything else he trotted out to meet her. It had been love at first sight, and now, for fear of losing her and through pure jealousy, he didn't go back to his running partners with her, but kept her away from them as much as he could. But them wise ones soon enough spotted him in the distance, and noticing there was a stranger with him, they all three trotted up to investigate. There was no use trying to get away, and when the three surrounded the filly, and also wanting to make an acquaintance with her, was the first time that Colonel ever set his ears back at them or showed any sign that they wasn't welcome to be near. He tried to stand between her and them, but they didn't pay no attention to him, and when he nipped Charo on the neck for getting too close, he was as surprised at the act as Charo was. Then he nipped one of the renegades. That surprised that wise one too, and like to make fun of the colt that he shouldn't be silly, he just landed a light kick on his ribs and let it go at that. But at last, and when their curiosity was satisfied and the acquaintance of the filly was made, they left him be with his first love and went on to grazing, cocking their ears at him and blowing their noses, like as much as to say, "Gee, ain't love grand?" Whether it was love and it was grand, Colonel sure acted strange since the filly came along. He was like in trance, and had eyes only for her. He'd of course once in a while glance toward his partners, and follow along wherever they went, for he didn't want to lose track of them either. But while in the open, him and his lady love would keep a mile or so away from them, seldom getting closer than half a mile, even in the rough country. It was a sort of queer the way Colonel had got so taken up with the filly. He'd run with bunches where there was many of 'em, and he'd paid no attention to 'em, no more than just another horse, but this slim sorrel filly wasn't like any of them. She'd sort of stirred something in him, like from away in the past when a young colt in the bluegrass country, a faint feeling that she was like the ones he used to play with then, not like these Mustang ones he'd been running with. Maybe she had the same feeling towards him, that she understood his kind and not the wild ones. How she came to be in that country alone was a mystery that didn't at all worry Colonel in trying to figure out. All he felt was that she was more like him than any horse he'd ever been with since leaving his mother's side, maybe of the same breed, the kind he'd been taken away from, and now that was what might have drawed him to her. One thing sure, she could run, the only one he'd seen that could near keep up with him. But there was another thing he also noticed. She wasn't wise to the wild horse country, and now he took it on to himself to teach and watch over her as Charo had over him, that is, as much as he could like Charo had. But as the two would wander away so far from the three wise ones, they would have been very easy pickings for a mustanger. Here was a chance that Blackie would sure like to have had, but as good luck would have it, there was few mustangers out at the time, especially in that part of the country, so they grazed and roamed along in bliss, still keeping track of the three wise ones and also their distance. Then one day, after a couple of weeks of such bliss, there come a rider who, with only his head showing above the top of a high ridge, first spotted three horses a mile or so below him. Them three was Charo and the two renegades, and then about the same distance from them was two more horses. The rider leveled his field glasses on them, and then a long pleased grin spread over his face. Then a puzzled expression come, for he couldn't figure out that sorrel with the brown, and leveling his glasses on the three horses, he couldn't figure out the grulla not being with them, that brown being apart from the grulla, and with the sorrel instead was what puzzled him. He pondered on that for quite a spell, and then the grin of a sudden came back, now even more pleased than before. It had all come to him as plain as day, and he couldn't have wished for anything to be more in his favor than they was right then. Knowing horses as he did, especially the brown and the grulla, he knew what had happened about as well as if he'd been right on the spot, that the two colts had separated, and the reason why, also that the brown still didn't want to be separated too far from the grulla. That's what he'd work on, and he'd have to work it just right or this good chance would be spoiled. The brown was the one the rider wanted, and knowing that it'd be about impossible to get him if he was to get in with the grulla and the other two again, he'd seen where it'd be best to spook them three out of that country first, and without the brown noticing, if possible, for if he did, he'd be very apt to want to join them, and with that speed of his, there'd be no stopping nor turning him from doing that. Of course, there was still the sorrel to consider. That one might be pretty hard to handle too, but the rider would figure on some chance with that one where he wouldn't if the brown got in with the grulla. Sizing up the country below, the rider seen where luck was with him some more, for in the mile space between the two bunches was a couple of strings of long ridges, high enough to well block the view from one to the other. Now was to keep out of sight of the brown and the sorrel, while getting to the other three. So picking his way around, he got off his horse, and until he got over the tall ridge he was on, then struck down a deep gully, which would have been better going for mountain goats than man and horse, but he was out of sight of horses there and seen when it led on. Down in between the long ridges below, where he'd be out of sight of both bunches. The distance to the horses was covered mighty careful and quiet, and when the rider figured he was even between the two bunches, he rode to the side of one of the bunches so he could only look over it, not showing himself. He spotted the three he wanted to spook away, and then getting to within as short distance as he could, he then spurted up to their full sight sudden, like him and his horse had just shot up from the earth, and rode full speed towards them. The so sudden appearance of the rider more than done the trick, and the three didn't hesitate as to where they should go. They just up and went, like the devil was on their tail, and straight away from the other two for rough foothills and rougher country above. There was no use chasing them on, for after the scare they'd keep on running until they was well out of the country. The rider watched 'em go for quite a while, and when they was only small dots bobbing over distant ridges, now and again, and finally entirely disappeared, he rode the opposite direction, and where the other two had been, now would be the real ticklish work. Depended a whole lot on the sorrel. He knew the brown would make a dash for where he figured Charo and the other two would be, and finding them gone, he'd be pretty well confused and lost as to where to go. Then would be the time to get 'em going towards some of the blind traps which the country was full of in some parts. He could tell better which way to try to head 'em after. He seen how the sorrel acted. That one might spoil everything and be as hard to turn or as wise as the Grulla and the other two. The only thing to do was to ride towards 'em slow and not spook 'em any more than was possible. Let 'em take their own course for a spell, then he'd know better as to how to proceed to run 'em. The rider had figured right. As he slowly rode up on the two and stopped his horse, they raised their heads, stood like petrified for a second, then the brown started into a lead, the sorrel only following. That lead hadn't been of the spooky jump and tight run of the wild horse, but just in a long, easy lope, like mighty confident they could outrun the rider if need be. But that rider didn't make no effort to run or try to turn 'em any direction. He just poked along and watched 'em while the brown led in a circle to get to the bunch of three he'd been keeping track of and running with before he took up with the filly. The rider had expected that and knew there'd be no use trying to stop him from making that run in looking for his ex-partners. Trying to do that would only made him worse. And now, when the brown come to where he'd last seen his partners, and there was no sign of 'em nowheres, he liked to went wild, nickering, running in big circles from knoll to knoll and ridge to ridge looking for 'em, but only in that neighboring part. But them three was many miles away from there by then, where he'd never be apt to find 'em again if he looked for 'em for a month. The rider had seen to that. Now, with the many long circling runs of looking for them, the brown was mighty confused, and another thing, the filly had quit following him, just sort of stood in one place, watching him making his long searching circles, appearing here and disappearing there, only to appear again and come back to her. The rider had got off his horse on a high knoll during the proceedings, and from there, watching all from a good distance, he seen that again luck was sure with him, for that sorry filly was not a wild one, but as gentle breeding as the brown originally was. What was more, he seen from her actions that she hadn't been amongst the wild ones for very long, that the brown wouldn't leave her, and that way the two could now be driven right on wherever wished, the same as any gentle-bred horses they really was. The filly wouldn't run from a rider, and soon as the brown had his good run and cooled down some, they'd be no trouble. And there was no trouble, only some mighty ticklish work in getting the brown to quieting down and not go to outrunning the rider as he had before, just for the fun of it and show he could do it. But the filly had most all to do in quieting him down, for when he'd start on one of his spurts, she'd just trot a ways, and soon enough he'd come back. The rider stayed well behind and sort of out of sight at such times, for he knew better than try to run him. It went on being ticklish for the rider that way until well out of the wild horse country and around the point of the last Badland ridge. And such an experienced rider as that one was all that had made that feat possible. There was 4 days of steady riding for that rider since he'd started the 2, and only 2 night stops. That was when the edge of the big valley was reached and the brown got to behaving so him and the filly could be corralled. And then on the 4th day comes sight of the Hippo Ranch, when now the brown colonel perked his ears and again stretched out on his lead, this time only to a good steady walk towards it. There would be a couple of weeks before Brad would be hitting out with the rodeo stock. There was still plenty of riding to be done near and away from the ranch in the meantime, and one day, while riding near the ranch, Virginia rode up alongside of him. She was riding Colonel. Colonel's long spell of freedom amongst wild ones hadn't made any changes in his action, only physical, which was considerable improved and developed. But the day Brad had run him into the corral after getting him from the wild horse country, he'd walked up to him and only acted pleased to see him close again, the same as the year before he got away, and as though that time of wild freedom had been only for a space of fun. Now that was over, there was no trace of wildness about him, and when the happy Virginia walked into the corral a little later, he nickered and came to meet her, the same as before, and as he always had while at the ranch. He well showed his long line of gentle breeding that way, but another year or so of the wild freedom as he'd had, and it might have been different. He might have been still gentle if caught, but there'd been a considerable loss of interest for the human. That interest would have been more for freedom, and as some do, get plenty mean. Colonel didn't get to that stage. He was still the kind, gentle, and willing colt when Brad brought him in the second time. As he'd ever been when once in the corral, and when Virginia again slipped her saddle on and rode him only a few days afterwards, he acted as though it had been just the day before since she'd done so. As for the sorrel filly, which was really Colonel's downfall, or the cause of his being caught, there wasn't so much thought spent on her. She looked like a very well-bred filly, and as Virginia laughed, good company for Colonel, and not at all the kind that would lead him out to some wild bunch as Charo had. Little Charo wasn't missed much on that account. Besides, all knew he'd sure take care of himself well. Virginia again took Colonel to hand, and went to ride him oftener and harder than before. It wasn't that she wanted to punish him for his second running away, but just that he now could stand much more riding, and she figured him to be at a good age when a horse learns best, if not rode too hard. Virginia wasn't one to ride any horse too hard, and now she wanted to teach him what she'd started out to the year before. That was pay attention to cattle, out-dodge 'em instead of wanting to run straight on and pass everything. To watch a rope and prepare for a jerk. To stop and hold the rope tight when a critter is down, and all that goes on with cow work. She told Brad about that one day of her troubles in teaching him any such, and remarking that her dad only laughed at her for trying. She asked him if he would try the colt out on just a good yearling, to see if he'd ever get next to pay attention to the rope and the yearling at the other end instead of just running on like he was in a race track. There was other things along other lines with the range work. she wanted to have Brad try on him and see if there was any hopes for him to ever be a good cow horse, or maybe a good rope horse to use in arenas during rodeos. At all of that, Brad had to laugh too, but one time, and to please her, he did get on Colonel and tried him. He tried him well amongst a good bunch of cattle, at roping and at what most everything a cow horse should do, and the only result was Brad's shaking of his head as he rode him out of the herd. Virginia had of course witnessed it all and had to agree with him. What Brad had always kept to himself was the fine breeding of Colonel, and for what purpose. He'd seen and broke well-bred horses that turned out to be fine cow horses, but even though he'd said so, he'd never had no intentions of making any such out of Colonel, for that pony was from too long and good a strain of track horses, to expect him to ever be anything else but that. He had no especial reason to buy him as a colt, excepting he just wanted him. Maybe Virginia would like him too, but back of it all was a hunch, and Brad went strong on hunches. Then after the deal was clenched, there comes sight of the colt's pedigree, and at that he felt his hunch had sure started right. As Brad and Virginia rode back to the ranch, Brad says to her, "You've rode this colt quite a while. That is enough so's to know if he has the natural knack it takes to make a cow horse. You could tell that after a few rides of your own horses, when you broke them, and with all the rides you've given Colonel, do you think he has the makings to ever match any in your string?" Virginia had to laugh a little. "Why, no," she says. "He goes by a cow so fast he never sees her, and if one would ever happen to be in the way, I'm sure he'd run right over her. No, as a cow horse he'll never do, but as for speed, he would make a jackrabbit ashamed of itself." Brad now had to laugh at her good describing of Colonel's failings and qualities. Finally he said, "The first rodeo I have on hand is only a couple of 100 miles away. Why not let's take Colonel and try him in a race there?" "It would be all right, I guess," says Virginia, wondering, "but who's going to ride him?" Brad smiled at her again and said, "You are." Chapter 14. Whitewashed. This race was to be a fair-sized one. Horses, much above the average, was entered from all parts of the state, and some still better from other states. There was good stakes and high betting, not much betting on Colonel, for nobody knew him. Virginia had of course never rode in a race before, and neither had Colonel been in such. The girl was a little nervous as to that, but Brad eased her some, got her a box stall to one quiet end of the stable, fitted her up with good jockey garb, and a young colored groom to fix up Colonel, and sort of coached her some. With all of that, she got to feeling pretty confident. She rode Colonel around the track a couple of times, not at his full speed, but just to make him acquainted with it, and let him know what was wanted of him. Besides, she herself wanted to get acquainted with that postage stamp-size piece of pigskin which was called a saddle, and she was supposed to ride on. Also the stirrups, so short that her knees near touched her chin. There was 3 races at that rodeo, going on between the events of bronc riding, steer riding, bull dogging, etc. Virginia and Colonel was up for the 3rd race, and when that time come, Brad was the one who led Colonel on the track and put him in his starting place. That eased Virginia a considerable, and even though Colonel was cool acting, all excepting for his first sight of so many people, he behaved like the sensible horse he was. One of the main things with him, Brad knew, would be the start along. With them crazy acting, experienced racehorses around him, but that was partly taken care of, for as Brad watched the race starter and in time gave the sign, Brad, like a flash, slapped Colonel along the flank and on the rump, and with the other horses starting so quick on both sides of him, Colonel was only his own half a length behind when the race began. Then the fun began. Fun for Colonel mostly, for he was running with other horses that really could run, with riders on 'em, and to him he got the same pleasure as he had in outdistancing and playing with the riders while on the wild horse range. He kept abreast of some of the few leaders for a spell, like as if to find out if they could run with him, and then when two riders sort of shouldered against his neck and tried to pinch him out is when, with the coaching of Virginia, the race really did begin. Colonel no more than got pinched back and got in the clear on the outside of 'em. When he left the riders like they was riding hobbled horses, favorites and well-known horses was passed on the same way. It was a mile race. Colonel was now playing with and getting away from them riders, the same as he had played and got away from the Mustangers, and when he crossed the line, head up like a wild horse instead of a race horse, there was so many horse lengths behind him that if they'd been flesh, there'd been enough to call it a herd. Old Cal had been on the job to see that radio and race, and his old racing spirit more than revived as he watched Colonel come to the line like he did. He was hard to hold down for a spell, and when Brad got to tell him there was another rodeo a few weeks off, and not so far away from this one, Old Cal bounced up and says, "Me and Virginia'll sure be there. We'll drive this time, and I'll bring that good horse trailer to put Colonel in, so he won't be jammed around in them stock cars amongst other horses. Don't you worry about Colonel. He gets less jamming around in the box cars I put him in than he would in a trailer. I got a partition for him the same as I had when I first brought him to the ranch when he was a little feller, and no jars nor other horses can bother him. About the same horses, jockeys, racehorse fans, and bettiers was there at the second rodeo. Rodeos include horse races, but it's called rodeo. There'd been heavy losses with playing the favorites when this unknown dark horse Colonel coming in so far ahead and so easy. And now, with this second rodeo race, he was of a sudden 20-1 the favorite. At seeing Colonel again up for the race, the owners of race horses got together and made a beller to the judges against letting him run as he was a thoroughbred. Cal happened along about then. Thoroughbred my eye, he chips in. Why, that horse has been with wild horses for 2 years anyway, and we been trying to catch him all that time. Figure that out. The judges grinned and looked at the squawkers. Then one of 'em says, "Supposing he is a thoroughbred, I happen to know that 3 of you sneaked in registered horses yourselves, so better keep quiet." Then there was talk of handicapping Colonel. Old Cal doubled up in a laughing fit at that. Why, you could put an extra 100 pounds on him. Put him on a muddy track alongside of yours, on a dry one, and he'll still fan his tail in your ponies' faces. Brad was over at the rodeo grounds by the chutes while all this was going on, and after laughing at what Cal told him of it, He got to thinking, that horse is too much for the smaller races. First thing he knew, they wouldn't let him enter him. It never even entered his mind to have the horse held back. That would spoil a horse with such a heart as Colonel's. The only thing he'd got to decide on would be to take to bigger races, but that would have to be apart from his rodeo work. Then he finally got to figuring, being he had contracts far and wide for rodeos, he'd use Colonel in such ones where that horse wasn't known. It wouldn't take long, of course, when he would be well known, but Brad thought that by being careful, he could get by that summer until fall, and the races Colonel would be having would be great training to him in preparing for the bigger races. At this second rodeo, Colonel outdistanced the other horses even more than before, for then he'd already learned to be ready and going from the start, not like the first when Brad had to slap him to going. There was no more pleased nor tickled girl than Virginia after so easy winning the second race, but near as sad a girl when the rodeo was over and Cal said it was time to pack up the car and hit back home for the ranch. The next rodeo Brad had to go on was some 500 miles away, and he would take Colonel with him. In his tall figuring, Brad had forgot that Colonel was Virginia's horse. He'd have to talk his plans over with her, and of course ask her permission to take him. The three walked to the hotel. Cal had his say as to how pleased he was about the second race. Then, seeing how Brad and Virginia began talking of the future plans for Colonel, the dividing of the winnings and such, and Cal, not wanting to get mixed up with that, stopped packing his bags, throwed up his hands, and hit the downstairs for the hotel bar to talk with the other horsemen about the race and what a horse his daughter had, that Colonel horse. These rodeos I've got on hand from now on, Brad went on to say to Virginia after Cal left, are quite some distance away and far apart. You and your dad couldn't very well follow them, and Virginia, I would sure like to take Colonel along. You can bet your boots he'll get the best of care and the best of riders. You've seen how the track is in his blood. Also found out he'd never be a cow horse. He's not bred for that. With his speed, there'd be some great winnings made at every rodeo, also outside races, and to make it fair and interesting, I'll do the handling of him and split the winnings with you. With her hands between her knees, Virginia only stared at the floor as he spoke, Brad watching her every expression. He knew she didn't want to part with Colonel, even if only for the summer months. He also knew she didn't give a whoop for any share or all the winnings. There was something else in her expression which was away beyond him to understand. It was no thoughts of the horse, and sure no thoughts of the winnings. He knew it was more as a yearning for something, for the lack of understanding there was very little hope of getting, if she would only speak. To get to the bottom of that last, Brad again brought up the subject which he figured she sort of resented but might bring her to talk on. What he couldn't understand, it was about the winnings. If you don't feel right about only half the winnings for your share, he begins as a stir-up. I'll give you all and keep only the entrance fees, expenses for the groom, and my general super. At that point, she turned her face at him, and a glance of her large, expressive, moist eyes did not surprise him. They told what he already knew, but what did surprise him was that they told she knew how he himself cared but didn't speak. It was some time afterwards when the door flew open and old Cal, feeling pretty good, caught the two sitting side by side, close, one arm around each other, both free hands clasped and heads together. Cal stared in surprise for a few seconds, then a long pleased grin spread over his face. "I knew it," he says. "I knew it would happen soon as my back was turned, and I turned it a purpose." Then to Brad, "You sure know how to pick winners. Virginia ain't so bad at that either. Now I see you had to get her in order to get Colonel. But she'll most likely take care of the winnings. But here, children." He took the hand of each and laid 'em one on top of the other, and holding 'em that way, he went on. "It ain't for an old sinner like me to say such things, but God bless you both, and I wish you all the happiness you two sure enough deserve." With the goings on of every rodeo, Colonel was put through the paces with the races that went along with 'em. Virginia, now Miss Braddock, as his jockey, who with every race got very wise to the tricks of the game, such as being crowded to the rail, held back by horses ahead, being pinched in, and so on. With such a horse as Colonel, she didn't try to at first hit for the inside and crowd the rail. Instead, she kept clear of all other riders from the start, took the outside, and it wasn't long when she'd be well in the lead and have the track and rail by herself the rest of the stretch to the line. Her and Brad would grin at one another, sort of sheepish, after each race, for it seemed a shame to take the money. The consolation they'd get would be the surprise and cheer of the crowds. The name Colonel got so spread and looked for on the programs that for fear the horse would be barred from the race on account of his super speed, Brad went to changing the horse's name at every race he was entered in. But many race fans had got to know that horse, and that made it even better for them to lay heavy bets on him, for the names would of course be unknown. To them who knew him by sight, he got to be called the Dark Horse. But regardless of the name changing, Brad had a hard time entering Colonel by the time fall come and the rodeo season was over. Brad and Virginia honeymooned at the ranch that winter in an L of the big ranch house. Red had to remark about that he'd have to mend his ways too, save his money and find the girl. That was quite some program for Red, but the big stump would be to find the place. Jim was satisfied to stay being the lone wolf, but he would sure like to get enough money together so he could buy a silver-mounted, diamond-studded bridle bit he'd seen. The price was $1,000. Brad didn't get to cross the mountains and go to contesting along the coast on south that winter. Virginia wouldn't let him for one thing, and another he didn't want to. He hadn't been allowed to contest no more since the knot was tied. His job from then was to keep charge of the bucking stock, arena directing, keep an eye on Colonel, and all his time outside of that on Virginia. But she'd sometimes take pity on him and let him get in on roping contests. While riding together that winter, breaking trail for snowbound cattle, bringing in the weaker stock to the feed grounds, there was of course many things talked about the future. Brad was for starting a ranch of his own, with good cattle and horses, and quit following the rodeos entirely, remarking it was no life he wanted her to follow, that he'd had enough of it himself, and so on. But there was no quitting just like that, and so, when spring and summer came on again, Brad, Red, and Jim went on with the stock as usual, and to fill the contracts that'd be made for the different rodeos. Virginia was of course right alongside of Brad and caring for Colonel. Many a track fan who knew the dark horse by sight kept looking for him at the rodeo races that summer, for to them, no matter what his name might be changed to, he was like a gold mine, for it was easy to get a 20-to-1 bet on him from others who didn't know him, being the name would most always be a strange one at each rodeo. But to the disappointment of them, many there came no sight of that wonder, the dark horse. There was one horse, though, that fooled as many as the dark horse had. This one was built the same as him, and had the same way of hitting the line from 5 to 10 lengths ahead of the other horses in every race, and you'd have swore he was the dark horse, only this one had big white spots on his shoulder and thigh, and a full-blazed face. He could near be classed as a pinto. Then again there was another horse of near the same color, size, and action as the dark horse, that fooled many who played him as being that dark horse. Heavy bets was laid on him, but he'd usually come in along between fourth and last. The pinto, or paint, as the fast one got to be called, soon made a reputation that spread, and no matter if his name was changed, them spots was what the betters bet on. But them spots wasn't like the leopards, for they could be changed, washed off, and under them was the dark brown hide of the dark horse, Colonel. Virginia had nothing to do in this dark conspiracy. In fact, she didn't like the idea of what she felt was cheating and changing Colonel's name, much less to turning him into a pinto. Brad and Red was the guilty parties there, and after Brad explained to her why he changed the horse in both names and color, that it was so he could enter him in the races, with no idea of cheating anyone, she then didn't object no more. If anything, she was willing to help, for, like Brad, she felt that Colonel was too good a horse to be left idle just on account of his goodness. In realizing and wanting to help that way, she would change from one outfit to another. When she rode Colonel as the dark horse, she rode as a jockey, of course, but with her hair a-flying as a girl, and when she rode him as the pinto, she darkened her hair and complexion, shoved her tresses under her cap, and at a distance looked all for the world like a sunburnt jockey. The costumes was changed too, and being the races was days and sometimes weeks apart, that was more pleasure for her than effort. And as for Brad and Red putting the spots on Colonel, or taking 'em off, that was no hard work either. All they had to do was mix a little thin whitewash, and with a fine spray of that plant, the spots where they wanted 'em. If they wanted Colonel, as he naturally was afterwards, a little water and a sponge would easy take them spots off. So easy that sometimes while Virginia would be riding him in such disguise, she'd be mighty worried of threatening showers and a muddy track. There was one time when a good shower did come during a race, while Colonel was spotted up and she was darkened up, and before the line was reached, the dark on her face was running down her shirt, and the white spots on Colonel washed off into the mud. She didn't waste no time by the judges or welcoming crowd that day. Along with the rodeos that play went on for that year, there was a couple of times when Colonel wasn't allowed to be entered, and a few times when he was recognized, spots or no spots, and he was allowed to come in, but only for the reason that the officials knew there'd be a safe bet on that horse, and a good chance for them to make a stake. Red would always put all he had on him, take all bets he could get, and he figured that if this kept up he'd soon be able to buy a good already running outfit. if he hung on to that money and then get the girl. Brad invested that way too, careful not to let Virginia know, and he'd made many times over the $400 he'd paid for Colonel when he'd bought him as a colt. Jim also throwed in his chips and got that silver-mounted diamond-encrusted bridle bit he wanted. All in all, everything went well. Quite a few track slickers was turned into whitewashed suckers, and as Colonel, along with bucking stock, the bucking stock, was shipped back to the ranch that fall, he was in fine condition, had good track experience, and was rearing to go on some more. Chapter 15. The Breed of 'em. With the rush of the late fall works, along with the beef roundup and shipping, the boys had no more than got to the ranch with the rodeo stock when they had to jump right in and go to work on the range. Cal had already started the works with the boys that had been kept steady on the outfit, and he'd hired 2 more to take the place of Brad, for as there'd need to be a rider at the ranch to ride from there, he'd decided, now that Brad was a married man, to let him have that job. Him and Virginia could handle things. So as Cal and his riders went to rounding up on the range, Brad and Virginia went to scouring the hills close to the ranch. Virginia went back to her regular range clothes, which felt mighty good, and her stock saddle again, and her string of ponies, which had got mighty fat and rollicky. With all the range work to be done, Colonel wasn't neglected. It was too late in the year for pasturing, but he had the freedom of the big corral, shed and box stall of nights. Virginia rode him now and again, just to sort of keep his spirits in good shape, but there never come no more thoughts to her mind of trying to make a cow horse out of him. She didn't put him to no range work, just a good run and a rub-down, and she didn't care no more now if he did pass a cow without seeing her while going through his paces. As good a care as that horse'd had while at the ranch, since he was a colt, it was near impossible that he could be getting more, but he was, and kept in as fine a trim and shape as any horse could be kept. He could have been jumped out of the stable at any time, and been ready for any race, with all of that care and all, adding on his long spells of wild freedom, which developed his body, stamina, heart, and courage, the sure handling of his long legs, and all which he couldn't have got in any training stables, and with his breeding to go with that, it was no wonder he was a super horse. And now that he'd had a couple of summers on the track for the finishing touches, well, it was along about middle winter when Cal, who'd been receiving racetrack news, which was kept being sent to him, telling of the outcome of the latest races, and the announcing of them that was to come, perked up his ears at one such news report. It was of a big race that was to be pulled off across the mountains to the coast. The stake was for $50,000, but what made Cal perk his ears was that amongst them who entered some horses was a Morgan Mansfield. Cal let out a war whoop, hunted up Brad, and pointed a finger at the name he could hardly speak for excitement. "There's an old enemy of mine," he says. "He's crooked me out of 2 races. Of course, I don't hold that against him, because there's no holds barred in races, like with love or war. but we are going to take in that race, and with Colonel we'll skin him out of his pants." It was hard for Brad to keep a straight face, and his mouth shut at surprise of the sight of Mansfield's name, and then at what Cal was aiming to do to him. The race would be for 4-year-olds. Mansfield had entered 2 of them, and it came to Brad that they would be Colonel's half-brothers. Cal was happy as a kid with stick candy at the prospect of getting back at Mansfield after so many years, while with Brad he was a little dubious. It was the next day when Brad came to Cal and asked, "What are you going to do for a jockey? You know, without me telling you, that there's no lady jockeys in such races. Besides, she couldn't go." He talked low into Cal's ear, and at that Cal's eyes near popped out with surprise. Then a long pleased grin spread over his face as he gripped Brad's hand and says, "Congratulations, my boy, congratulations. God bless your hide." But the jockey matter was a serious one, and Cal paced the floor some that evening and wrinkled his brows on the subject. Then, like the sun breaking through the clouds, it came to him. The roads was hardly fit for automobiles on account of deep snowdrifts, but Cal put on his heavy skid chains and hit out as though he was skimming along on a boulevard. When he seen a bad drift ahead, he put the spurs to the powerful motor, and the way he drove it would have took an iceberg to have stopped him. He made it into town and in front of the telephone office in good skidding shape. There he called for long distance to the warden of the state prison. There was a long confab between him and that warden, and when he walked out of that office there was a very satisfied look on his face. It would be about 3 months before the big race would take place. A jockey should get acquainted with the horse he's to ride, and the horse acquainted with him, and the training. Then there was the transportation to be considered. So a month before the time for the race, Cal drove some 100 miles to the state prison to see the warden there. There was another confab, and after a spell a grinning little feller bearing a number was shaking hands with Cal. It was Blackie. The warden spoke. "Well, Blackie," he says, "I'm going to let you go on your honor and in charge of our friend Cal Goodwin here. I know you won't break that trust." The warden leaned back on his chair and smiled at him. "I'm betting on you," he went on, "and not only you, but on a good horse to win. If you do win, or even if you don't. But try, I'll see what I can do for you for a parole when you get back." He stood up, reached over the desk, and shook hands with him. "I have faith in you, and good luck." Then he looked at Cal with a half grin and a squint, and says, "As for you, don't you ever come back to this state without him and the winnings." There was no happier or grateful a half-pint-sized cowboy than Blackie, as Cal drove him out to the ranch and turned Colonel over to him. That horse had led him on many a chase while on the Wild Horse Range, sort of played with him and then run on, leaving him behind as though he was tied. He'd cussed his hide many a time for that, all the while admiring him, and now feeling and knowing the smooth power of him, he looked up at that horse, not only as a cause of relief from the iron bars, but as one that'd lead others on a merry chase. Blackie would see to that. Virginia didn't at all mind turning Colonel over to Blackie, for she felt and seen that with his care and handling the horse would do wonders, more than she'd ever done or could ever do herself, and that was going some. There was a week or so of light training at the ranch. Then Colonel was loaded into Cal's best horse trailer. Cal took the wheel at the car, and with Blackie beside him, the three hit for the now open mountain passes and for the track many 100 miles away, where the race was to be held, but not before Brad, Red, Jim, and some of the other boys dug up all they could for Cal to place on Colonel for them. "You see, Blackie," says Cal as they started out, "we sure have got to win." "Yes," says Blackie, "and I only wish I had something to chip in too." Cal grinned. "I'll stake you," he says. After 3 days of driving, the track was finally reached, a good big stall located, and there Blackie made camp, right beside Colonel. He didn't want to go to no hotel and wouldn't trust no groom. Cal brought him his meals, and with his 6-shooter, which he'd dug out of his war bag before leaving the ranch, always kept right handy, he ate and slept right by Colonel. The 2 weeks or so before the race was more than enjoyed by both man and horse. Blackie, very much used to night riding and in mighty rough countries, wouldn't put Colonel to his good speed on the smooth track only at that time, when everybody was asleep. This was a sure enough dark horse, and he didn't want no one to see him stretch on a run. In daytime he'd only lope him out a bit and then rub him down. Nobody paid much attention to either him or the horse. They was only a little curious at a branded horse running in such a race, and a cowboy-looking feller as a jockey, and who wouldn't mix with anybody. During that time, Cal had run Mansfield down. He was the boy he was after, and Mansfield, remarking how Cal was sure a glutton for punishment, covered all he wanted to bet. It was a plenty, and paying 5-1 to Cal's favor if he won. The day of the race finally come, and Cal was on the job early that day to see that all was well with Blackie and Colonel. Also to size the other horses again, especially Mansfield's. The spirit of the old racing days more than come back to him, and he felt a mighty tense but pleased feeling as he'd return to take another look at Colonel. He felt it in his bones that he'd win. Blackie also felt the same, but he sort of wished it was over. He rolled and smoked cigarette after cigarette, while Cal chewed on cigar after cigar. The two talked some, while one and then the other would stroke Colonel's smooth side, like as if to make sure there wasn't a flaw in even one of his hairs. "We got to win this race, Blackie," Cal once said, "and as you know, for many more reasons than one." Blackie didn't bother giving any word answer to that. He just grinned, confident, and like as to say that it was already the same as one, with the well-known Mansfield horses being played as favorites by most, and very few bets laid on the unknown Colonel. Unknown in the big racing circles, the ponies was finally lined up and began filling towards the starting chutes, some of 'em prancing and going sideways, while Colonel, being led by Cal, was as quiet and cool as an old cow horse. He was the same when he was brought to a stand in his chute, while on each side of him was a couple of rearing, bit-fighting, nervous ones, which couldn't be held in their chutes, and would lunge out, and had to be brought back in time and again. That held the starting a considerable, but that's to be expected at any race. Cal, now that action had started, lost all his tenseness. So did Blackie, who kept one eye on the starting flag and the other on the goings-on. Monocled Mansfield was to one end of the chutes, watching his trainers and jockeys. Then of a sudden, the commotion stopped for a few seconds, like the quiet before the storm. The ponies was all in good line, and out went the starting flag, which acted as if a bombshell exploded behind each horse. Colonel, being quiet, was a slow starter, but this time he started fairly good, only half a length behind the two crazy. Ones that had been on each side of him. Them two started out so fast they thought they had wings and forgot to use their legs. About 5 lengths from the starting line, rammed against one another and piled up right in front of Colonel. Cool-headed Colonel tried to jump the mix-up, but he was too close when it happened, and he piled upended right on top of him. A cloud of dust was stirred by the scrambling hooves, but Cal could see the Mansfield ponies in the clear and hitting out. At that same time there come a heavy slap on his back and a roaring, laughing voice saying, "There goes your money, Cal, old boy." At the slap and being tense, Cal bit his cigar in two, swallowing the part he had in his mouth. He couldn't and didn't want to speak for a spell, for even though near choking his eyes was at the instant of Colonel, which had fell in the heap a-running, turning over and got up a-running, with Blackie out of the saddle but right into it again, a feat that had never been witnessed before, and on with the racehorse and rider went, leaving the other two riderless horses still scrambling to their feet. Not many paid much attention to this unknown horse, nor the other two. The Mansfield horses was well in the lead, but the race was still young. Blackie stuck his nose in Colonel's mane, looked through between his ears and says, "Come on, son, let's head 'em off." As the track was cleared, Mansfield scrambled up the judge's stand, Cal right on his heels, and by the time they got up there and looked around, the first lap was near over. And Colonel had headed off many lengths, separating him from the Mansfield horses. In fact, there was only 1 length to their tail, and there was still another lap to go. Colonel was only getting warmed up at the start of the second lap. The Mansfield horses was neck and neck and hugging the rail, well in the lead of the others and with reserve speed to go on. Then, as the shadow of the dark horse Colonel crowded up on 'em, that speed soon began to be used up. They soon went to their level best, but it didn't seem to be of no use. That shadow kept a-crowding up on 'em until it reached their flanks. Then the Mansfield jockeys began using their whips. Blackie didn't have nor want no whip. Steadily from the flank and a rib at a time, that shadow crept up on 'em. The two Mansfield horses was still nose to nose as the shadow crept to the shoulder point, and there was still 100 yards to go. Then Blackie, now with his eyes on the two jockeys and his mouth close to Colonel's ears, just only whispered, "Let's go now, cowboy." And at that, the range-trained thoroughbred spurted up as though he hadn't as yet tried to run and near folded him up against the rail. When the finishing line was reached, he was 2 lengths ahead of the Mansfield horses, the best of his own half-brothers. It would be impossible to describe the feelings of old Cal as he drove up along the coast road, heading back for home, also of Blackie's riding beside him. Even Colonel looked around mighty proud through the windshield of his trailer. Reminiscing as he drove along, Cal felt mighty happy that besides the big winnings for all concerned on his side, he'd evened up an old score, and in such a way that it made quite a dent, not only to Mansfield's purse, but to his pride, for after the race, and as Mansfield wondered and asked Cal what that horse Colonel was and where he came from, Cal then was mighty pleased to show him the bill of sale Brad had given him just before leaving the ranch. Mansfield was more than surprised and frowned at it as he seen it was written on the back of a registered paper, showing he was a colt from Montezuma. He remembered then it was the little colt he'd ordered taken away and sold on account he was off color from Montezuma's other colts and would be a blemish to them. He felt more than mortified, and that had pleased Cal some more. As they drove along the smooth highway, Blackie began to notice signs advertising a rodeo. He'd first noticed 'em at the back of some passing cars, the dates and location. They would reach that town about the middle of the next day, and the contest wasn't to start until the day after that. Seeing such sign after sign got to bearing on him, and as they stopped in a little town on the way for the night, and before he unrolled his bed in the feed corral, and by Colonel he had to come out with it, and ask Cal if he'd noticed the sign advertising the rodeo. "Sure," says Cal, with a suspecting grin. "Want to see it." "I sure would like to," says Blackie, "and more than that, I want to enter and contest in it." Cal rubbed his chin for a spell. "It's a 5-day contest." "Blackie, you know, and if you aim to reach the finals, why—" "Yes, I know," says Blackie. "I know how anxious you are to get back home, but you're not," Cal added on. He put his hand on Blackie's shoulder. "Well," he says, after a spell, "you've sure earned a good stay away, and I'm sure the warden won't care. As for me, I'll enjoy it all with you, bet your life. Let's whoop her up. We both ought to celebrate some." That was more than agreeable with Blackie, and the first thing he done on arriving in the rodeo celebrating town the next day was to enter in the saddle bronc riding contest. He was itching for just that only, and didn't enter in any other contest. A good big box stall for Colonel, and another next to him where Blackie throwed his bedroll, and all was set for the fireworks. Cal and Blackie took in the town, and mixing the cowboys with the cowboys who'd come there to contest, many of which they knew. It wasn't long before they got in right good spirits. Many of them cowboys knew and had contested on Cal's rodeo stock. He was made more than welcome, and when the committee learned he was in town, knowing he'd won the big race, they sort of kidnapped and bowled him over with honors. In all that commotion, Cal and Blackie got separated, and when Cal went to the stables the next morning and seen no sign of him in the box stall next to Colonel, his heart missed a few beats, but it was just for the time, for he wouldn't believe that Blackie would do such a thing as break his trust. Still, he thought, with such a good chance and so far away from his barred stall, it would be quite a temptation for any man to resist. He walked over to the rodeo grounds, where many of the boys had gathered, and asked a few if they'd seen him. None had. He was about to leave the grounds and going by the headquarters when a feller hollered at him, saying that somebody had just called up wanting to know if Goodwin was here, and if he was, for Pete's sake, hold him. Cal was mighty relieved and easy held. Soon enough, Blackie, near out of breath, showed up. "Didn't know where in Sam Hill you went last night," he says. "Been looking for you ever since." Come to comparing notes, they'd been going in circles right around, looking for one another. Blackie had just got through caring for Colonel that morning, and hadn't been gone but a few minutes when Cal came looking for him, and him gone to make another round looking for Cal. Well, that was that, and as they talked on, they went to the corrals by the chutes to look at the rodeo stock. Blackie rode that afternoon in the tryouts on a good tough horse, and qualified for the semifinals. He done as well in the semifinals and qualified for the finals. There was a couple of days waiting between each ride, and he now wished he'd entered in more events. such as bareback bronc riding and steer riding, just to keep in action, but it was too late now to enter in them events. The last day of the rodeo came. He rode for the finals and surprised the judges, other contestants, and all how that little cowboy could ride, but size don't count when it comes to riding. Blackie made the finals in good shape, and now him and only 6 other boys was up for the grand finals. Blackie pulled his hat down tight, pulled his chap belt up some, and when his name was called, climbed down the bucking chute and into the saddle, on top of a grand final horse. It was the pick of the roughest, which means the same in that game as speed does in a race, winners. The horse was a little dirty gray, and when the chute gate opened, there was no hesitation from that horse. He started bucking right in the chute, which is mighty dangerous for the rider, legs and body, and in watching out for that does not get a fair sitting. Some of the boys spooked the little gray out of the chute. He was a spinning bucker, about the hardest kind to ride, but this one was still harder, for instead of just spinning every hard and quick jump he landed was a spin back, no forward bucking jump. The limbering up at the race, even though it was plain riding, is all that saved Blackie in that ride. A man can't be in a prison yard and sell a couple of years without getting stale some. Another thing that saved Blackie was that he rode by the feel of his horse, and not by the grip nor main strength. The hardest bucking horse for him to ride was a straightaway, where it was just the opposite with most riders. According to the judges, and even with the boys he was contesting against, all agreed Blackie made a great ride. Taped spurs away up on his shoulders, which he had to do in order to make that ride, and which also added up on points. The little gray hardly left the chute and didn't cover much more than 10 feet of ground in his bucking, but what all he done in that small space made even the watchers' heads swim. The judges' whistle blew, calling it a ride. The pickup man rode up, but the little gray was still at it, and whirling so fast that he couldn't get to reach the bucking rein. Then everything of a sudden got hazy for Blackie, and the next thing he knew he was down to good solid old Mother Earth, grabbed himself 2 handful of it, and ate some. Cal was right there, and the first one to him, but Blackie was right up on his feet, and even though considerable dizzy, made it to the chutes to lean on 'em for a spell. When the timbers of the chute got to looking straight again, and the world right side up, he turned to Cal, who was right near him, and says, "I want to take a look at that horse." He started across the arena to another corral, where the ridden and would-be ridden buckers was unsaddled and turned loose in two. Cal went on with him. Many buckers was in the corral, as many as there'd been rides, and as that was the last day of the contest, there'd been many rides. The two, in looking at the horses, had nothing to go by excepting the color of the horse, and they got very little chance to see that. The pickup man came in with another horse, and Blackie asked him, "Which horse did I just ride or ride at?" The pickup man laughed and pointed him out. Blackie had lost his dizziness by then. He squinted at the little dirty gray. Then turning to Cal, he says, "Do you see what I see?" Cal was doing some powerful squinting himself at the time, but hardly dared believe his eyes. "It can't be Charo, can it?" he finally asks, puzzled. "It sure can, and is," says Blackie, mighty positive. The last grand final ride over. Blackie had the pickup man rope the little gray, Charo, not so little now, but little as compared to the 1,400-pound bucking stock that was being used. Blackie went along the rope to the gray's nose. A signal pull on the rope for slack, and he had a half hitch on that pony's nose. But the pony was mighty outlaw. Blackie then jerked the half hitch off his nose and says to the pickup man, "Haze him to the chute, will you? I want to get a close look at that iron brand on him, and I don't want to have to throw him for that." In the chute the iron was looked over. It was, as Cal was close. Blackie pointed at the iron and asked him, "Can you make out yours there?" Whoever changed that iron was no artist at it, and felt safer in getting him out of the country. There was of course no doubt but that the horse had been stolen. Even amongst wild horses a branded horse belongs to the owner, and Cal's aim was to lay his claim on him. He was on the prod fight as he headed for the headquarters. Blackie right beside him on the prod too, but the prod was took out of 'em as they entered the offices, and all was paying off, for as Blackie showed his physog, alongside Cal, he was greeted so that it took the pins from under him. Also Cal's, and Blackie was presented with a silver and gold flowered trophy about his arm's length. At the same time, judges and all being there, he was acclaimed the champion bronc rider. Cal was as happy as Blackie was with the winning of the more honors, but Charo and the getting of him was still on his mind, and being elated over Blackie's ride, he was more than ever forgetting that little gray. It would be another winning of his and Blackie's to take home, and make Virginia and all the more happy. The stock promoter for the rodeo was at another desk, getting his money, and Cal, spotting him, left Blackie with his tall trophy, prize moneys, honors, and all to see that gentleman. Cal didn't chew his words as he came to him, straight to his elbow, and says, "Mister, you have a horse in your bucking string that don't belong to you." This gentleman took that kind of easy, and while he counted his money, not even looking at Cal, "So," he said, "what horse is it?" "You call him Cream Puff in your string," says Cal, "but my name for him is Alexander the Great, and I've got my iron on him to prove it. I can see it right through that reversed CG, and do you know, young man, that there's quite some penalty for anyone who buys stolen stock, the same as the one who steals 'em." At that, the gentleman stopped counting his money and looked at Cal. "Are you accusing me of buying stolen stock when I know they're stolen?" he asks, up on his toes. "Well," says Cal, "I'm not in the habit of accusing anybody in any way, but it would behoove you well, especially the way you're acting, to turn that horse back to whoever owns him. That's me." "Why," says the gentleman, "what proof have you got he's yours?" Cal had to laugh. "You can read brands. I know you could see through that brand, and it was originally the CG. Any stock inspector here or anywhere can see that. And besides, I've got witnesses right here to prove to you that he's my horse." It was at about that time when Blackie, breaking loose from handshakes and congratulations, sidled up alongside of Cal, and he pipes in, smiling sort of serious, "Anything you say can be used against you. I know the horse." There was a few more backed him up on that, and with Cal at the gentleman's elbow, this gentleman forgot to keep counting his money and bellered, "Why, he's the best bucking horse I've got. He never was rode before until this little black monkey," pointing at Blackie, "came along." "Can't help that, mister," says Cal. "We aim to get what's ours." But he added on, "If you want to serve the same terms as the ones who stole the horse, That's your privilege. There was no more argument. In fact, that feller was glad to just keep on counting his money before he said, "Take him away." "And I don't need no bill of sale either," Cal answers back. "In our country we hang fellers who deals with anybody's horses but their own." That was the parting words. That evening, while it was still light, and before the bucking stock was taken out of the grounds, Blackie drawed his loop up around Charo's neck, snubbed and slipped a hackamore on his head. Then, of a sudden, as peaceful as that wild horse was outlaw, he followed Blackie out of the corral. In a short time he was loaded in the two-horse trailer, right alongside of his old partner, Colonel. He fought and snorted some before getting in the trailer, but soon as he got alongside of Colonel, and Blackie and Cal closed the tailgate on the both, he drawed a long breath of ease. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the 2 men and 2 horses, had only one more day's drive to get home on. That was done in good time over summits during the cool of the following night. After all, had rested and fed during the heat of the day. It was during that third night's driving that Cal, glancing at Blackie as he drove, remarked, "That trophy of yours, Blackie." "Yes," says Blackie. "Well," Cal went on, "it means a lot more than just that. It's what it might hold, and to my knowing, with the ribbons and winnings, the square and good way you done it, in the race and rodeo, why I know that all is near as effective as if the warden himself opened the gate. Me and him'll see to that." As the two talked on of the past week's events, there was 2 ponies back of 'em, shoulder to shoulder, and bracing one another while the car wheeled 'em around the mountain curves. There didn't need to be no talk with them two. They'd always be all for each other, and masters at their own different games.